Good morning and welcome to the launch of CDE's unemployment report. My name is Wandile Sihlobo. I'm a member of the advisory board at CDE. As some of you that are joining us online today may know, CDE has been engaged on issues of economic growth and labor market in South Africa for roughly 3 decades. So the insight that we will get to share this morning in part draws from that wealth of information. How the agenda for the day will go is there will be a presentation which should take roughly 30 minutes, and that will be followed by a Q&A. So we encourage all of you to continue putting on any of the comments, questions on the chat box. Right after the presentation, we will be able to read your chat box and your questions, and they will be answered as best as we can. The person who will lead the presentation for today is our Executive Director, Bernstein. And welcome. And again, thanks to everyone that is with us online. And I will pass over to you, Anne, and then we will connect again at the Q&A session. Over to you, Anne.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us. We meet at a time when South Africa is in deep trouble, and every day we read about industrial companies closing down or major firms that are retrenching. And it's in this troubling context that CDE is releasing this new report today. Let me share share our slides. So this is the 22nd report that CDE has produced on the growing crisis of unemployment in our country. Since 2009, we have been highlighting the facts and making proposals for how to reverse unemployment. The situation now can only be described as catastrophic. In effect, a complete failure of government. The country's most devastating crisis is not the crumbling collapse of state institutions. It is not the persistent looting of state resources through corruption. Our most devastating crisis is unemployment. So what are the headlines of the report we are releasing? We have the world's deepest unemployment crisis. Public employment projects, youth initiatives, the president's employment stimulus, these are wholly inadequate responses to where we are. What we need is faster growth and employment. We have to raise the rate of growth, and we have to also focus on making this a much more labor-absorbing economy. We shouldn't give up. I think some people have given up. We can turn this around. We've got to implement the reforms we're going to talk about today, and there's no reason at all why we cannot implement all of them right now. So what are the hard facts? In 1994, we had 3.7 million unemployed. Today, we have 12.6 million people who would want to work but cannot find a job. Fewer than 4 in 10 working age adults are employed. and we are a complete global outlier. Upper middle income countries like ours employ around 60% of their adult population. We are now below 40%. Between 2008 and 2025, our labor force grew by 42%, but total employment rose by just 15%. What this means is that some 1,000 South Africans join the unemployment queue every single day for the past 17 years. The queue for jobs gets longer and longer. If a few jobs are advertised, thousands of people turn up. Now, this is not a picture of everyone voting in 1994. This is a picture taken this year in Johannesburg. Cartrack is a company in Rosebank, and earlier this year, they opened applications for learnerships. The resultant queue clogged up traffic across Jan Smuts Avenue as applicants stood in line for hours and hours and hours. There were 500 learnerships available, but there were 7,000 applicants. For every person who got in, 13 other people were turned away. Almost half the unemployed do not have a matric. Some 40% only have a matric. And although we talk a lot about graduate unemployment, only 10% of the unemployed have any kind of post-matric qualification. What South Africa needs are jobs for the workforce we have today, not the highly skilled workforce we wish we had. There's been a dramatic rise in long-term unemployment. In 2008, 57% of unemployed people were in long-term unemployment, longer than a year. In 2025, 77% of the unemployed had been unemployed for a year or more. What's happening is that we are deepening the marginalization of a vast underclass of permanently excluded, unemployed citizens. I think it's true to say, as we did in 2019, no country for young people. Unemployment is not just about statistics or economics. It's a human tragedy that affects individuals, their families, their communities, and the future stability and prosperity of the country. We could compile reams and reams of quotes from young people who are trying, but losing hope. They're living in desperation, feeling completely trapped in poverty as a result of the growing unemployment catastrophe. The unemployment rate for young people aged 15 to 34 is about 56%. That's 7.2 million people. In 2019, the National Treasury did a study and found these 5 districts were the places with the lowest employment rates in the country. all remote rural districts far from any significant economic activity. The worst district is Msinga in rural KwaZulu-Natal, where less than 10% of working-aged people are employed. That means less than 10,000 out of 97,000 people in Msinga. We can't give you more up-to-date figures because sadly Stats SA says that regional data is very unreliable and can't be used as a basis for regional breakdowns of unemployment anymore. But we don't think the situation has changed for the better since 2019. Now, why are things so bad? There's one word that explains almost all of this. We just don't have the growth that South Africa needs. Now, we all know the major failures that have stifled growth and therefore job creation. The collapse of state-owned companies, deepening fiscal crisis, high levels and persistent levels of corruption, municipal collapse around the country, and badly conceived and implemented economic transformation and industrial policies. Each of these failures on their own would have slowed growth. Taken together, they have collapsed growth to little more than zero. And when an economy doesn't grow, nor does the number of jobs. Economic growth is by far the most potent lever for reducing unemployment. And a government that says it wants growth, but at the same time introduces policies that cripple growth and doesn't remove obstacles to further growth, is not serious about unemployment. Now, in 2024, in the general election, the ANC's manifesto made the following offer to voters. They promised voters 3.5 million work opportunities. This was about 2.5 million jobs in expanded public works or other public employment schemes, and 1 million jobs somehow through providing young people in townships and rural areas with money to start or maintain micro businesses. The truth is that work opportunities are not real jobs. These are mainly state-funded employment in temporary, sometimes part-time employment. Now, on the best evidence available, we calculate that it takes 2.8 million work opportunities to result in 250,000 full-time jobs, what we would normally consider jobs. Make it 300,000 if some of these are part-time. So think about this. The president's commitment to South Africa, the centerpiece of the ruling party's promise, or the most dominant party, it was the ruling party then, their priority number one on their election manifesto is essentially the appalling equivalent of 300,000 low-wage jobs over 5 years. Now, what South Africa is offering then is work opportunities when South Africans need jobs. And the government's focus is on public employment programs and youth initiatives. Most of these last less than 3 months if you're in a public employment program, and you generally paid below the national minimum wage. The president's employment stimulus jobs, also paid for by the public sector, involve short-term opportunities such as classroom assistant positions that also end after a few months. And you will have seen that yesterday, the president and the ANC doubled down on this approach, where they called for a massive scale-up of the presidential employment stimulus and other employment programs. They didn't tell us where the money would come from, but that's another point. Now, these projects are certainly not meaningless, but they're wholly inadequate when you look at what faces South Africa today. They are not capable of solving a crisis that affects more than 12 million people. They're limited and temporary relief, and they're no substitute for real employment. The truth is that the government has failed to address the structural causes and depth of mass joblessness. They have failed to act with urgency or to mobilize a coalition for the changes that are desperately required. In the past 15 years, both government and organized business have focused far more energy on special projects and youth initiatives that create a limited number of jobs or work opportunities than they have on the hard work needed to achieve policy reform to create millions and millions of market-based jobs. The truth is that government policy holds back employment. Labor market rules make employers reluctant to hire unskilled and inexperienced work seekers, while minimum wages have priced tens of thousands out of jobs. Bargaining council agreements often impose big business standards on small firms that cannot afford them. And restrictions on temporary employment services, so-called labor brokers, prevent young, inexperienced workers far from any networks or economic opportunity. They prevent these people from accessing vital entry-level opportunities. Nearly 3/4 of South Africans without matric are unemployed. The TVETs, the technical and vocational education and training colleges, fail to prepare students for jobs, producing graduates that employers often view as unemployable. The SETAs, the Sector Education and Training Authorities, created to address skills shortages, are widely viewed as wasteful, corrupt, and irrelevant. Small businesses, which are typically more labor-intensive than larger firms, face an environment that in some respects is openly hostile. Overregulation, high compliance costs, and endless red tape squeeze entrepreneurs and reduce new business formation and growth. International studies show that South Africa's regulatory environment is more restrictive than nearly all OECD and G20 countries. Now, informal trading is criminalized by licensing requirements and harassment by local authorities. Instead of enabling entrepreneurship and livelihood strategies, government agencies actively stifle it. Now, what should we do? The ANC might have given up on creating millions of real economic jobs, but we certainly have not, and the country should not. South Africa can turn the tide of rising unemployment. Now, we're certainly not saying it's simple or easy, and we certainly do not have all the answers or a silver bullet. But we do have practical suggestions on where to start immediately on a different path that will encourage much more employment. And if South Africa is to take unemployment seriously and confront the reality of its massive scale, there are 4 areas of reform that we would start with. The most important reforms revolve around the labor market. The rules here impact the most on low-skill workers and small firms. And we have 4 proposals. We should encourage employers to hire more workers, and in order to do that, we propose an amendment to the LRA, a probation period of 12 months, with no special protections against dismissal, except for obvious things like racism. We should immediately stop extending collective bargaining agreements. A big company in Cape Town might make a deal with its union partners. That's fine. But that should not be extended to small firms, to rural firms, to new startups, to anyone else who's not in that room. We must open access to the labor market, and we're calling for the removal of restrictions on labor brokers. If you're living far away from Johannesburg and you don't have a network of how to get a job or a brother who's got a job, labor brokers are often the only mechanism to get you an opportunity to get a job. And then lastly, which some of you have heard us talk about more than once, we should try something new. Let's initiate labor market reform in a deadlocked situation through an experimental special economic zone where Kucha would be the best place to do this, and let's experiment with new rules to see if we can attract low-skill factories and try and create jobs, as almost many other developing countries have done and are doing. So that's the first area of reform. The second concerns the skills system. We need to incentivize TVETs to partner with business. We need a different approach to funding rather than bums on seats, as they call it. We need results-based funding. Instructors must have industry experience and work-based learning components for all TVETs. We should scrap the seaters altogether. Let's do it. Stop mulling about. They're not performing their function. This was a failed experiment. We want a completely different approach. It needs to be driven by private companies, and they need to bring in private training services whenever they need them. And we should minimize the role and costs incurred by the state, because the seaters are very expensive. Now, a key reason why our workforce is unskilled is, of course, our appalling basic education system. We're not focusing on this today. In 2023, CDE released 5 documents we called the Silent Crisis, 5 reports on the state of South Africa's schools and how to fix the basic education system. This is a topic for another day, but it's important to note that our failure to even have some ambition to fix this schooling system in a fundamental way has a big impact on the skills of our workforce. Our third area of reform concerns small business. And here we have what we think could be two really important proposals. This hoary old issue of cut red tape, which sounds very boring and never seems to happen, is actually really important. We have to get rid of the regulations that hold back dynamism in the small business sector. And we are proposing an SME test for new legislation or regulations on how will they impact small businesses before any new regulation or legislation. We're also saying, instead of endless debates in a dark room in Pretoria, where people say, oh, this is a good idea, we do need to deregulate, but you can't touch the following holy cows, we're saying, let's do something revolutionary. Let's ask small firms themselves, what holds you back? What are the regulations that prevent you employing a few more people or expanding? You tell us. And then let's bring this whole issue of red tape removal out of the dark. Let's shine some sunlight here. We want report backs from government. We want them every 3 months. We want to know what has been deregulated. We need a feedback mechanism. How has it worked or not worked? And we need some momentum here. But this is how to get a whole new approach to this issue that department after department every year, or the presidency tells us we must cut red tape, but we don't seem to see the kind of impact that the economy needs. Our second proposal is we should stop what is effectively a failed state-led approach to SMME development. We undertook research a few years ago, and the conclusion was about 6 billion rand a year is spent by state agencies in promoting small business. What we couldn't find was what impact that money has. So we're saying, let's try a completely different approach. Promoting small business is not easy. This is a difficult task. And we should give it to the experts in our society, and that's the private sector. Not that they're perfect, but they are the best people equipped with experience of how to identify dynamic small businesses that have potential to grow. So let's take half the money that the state is spending every year, and let's get private institutions to compete for this money and tell us what they would do and what more they would do to promote small businesses. Let's encourage innovation, but most important, let's focus not on the amount of money, but on what impact it actually has. Are the 100 firms you helped this year actually surviving? Are they growing? What did you do? Who's making this happen in the most effective way? Again, we should track the funds very carefully, and we need transparency about outcomes. A day a year in Parliament, where the public sector and the private agencies tell us what they did with their money to encourage small business, and let's look at who's doing well. The fourth area of reform concerns the informal sector. Now, we would be the first to say that the country probably doesn't know as much as we should about the informal sector in South Africa. But it's really important to not romanticize informal activity. These are not great jobs. No training, no formal training, no career path. They don't conform with health and safety standards. They're informal, they're unregistered, they They're doing whatever they can. So we should allow this to expand, but don't romanticize it. We should apply our SME test for small businesses and what regulations hold the informal sector back. We should apply it to informal firms as well. State government agencies should facilitate, but not prohibit, informal activity. And city governments could, for example, look at zero rating licenses for street traders. Informal activity thrives on lots and lots and lots of foot traffic. We need to promote the densification of our cities for many reasons, and this is one, to expand small business activity, formal or informal, and we have a whole lot of recommendations on how to do this. Cut red tape for small housing developers, invest in the public infrastructure so we don't get slums, and make state land available for low-cost housing in well-located areas. There's some bigger issues. We do need a new housing policy, which CDE has talked about a lot in the past, but one that encourages urban densification. And we agree with some academics that we should explore transport subsidies for informal traders who remain located far away from economic activity and where transport is a major obstacle to their survival and growth. So to pull this all together, mass unemployment requires a new approach altogether. The country needs a more labor-absorbing and much bigger economy. Serious reforms are required with urgency that actually deal with the fundamental issues. We need to harness the power of markets and private enterprise. This is the only solution to unemployment, not more and more and more public works programs. In our view, business should stop compromising, should stop being silent on the major issues. They should promote fundamental reform. They should look for allies for reform, and they should shout loudly about what is required. Government needs to take mass unemployment seriously. The policy reforms we need can, in our view, be implemented now. What is missing is leadership and political will. The choice before South Africa is stark. We can act with urgency, embrace real reform, and create a pathway to inclusive prosperity. Or we create another lost generation condemned to the despair and anger of joblessness. The time for hesitation, compromise, prevarication has long gone. We need reform, fundamental reform, now. What the country needs is, in a sense, a new social contract. It's one built on growth and employment as the twin pillars of national prosperity, hope, and stability for the country. If you look at the past, at about 4% growth per annum, we create 400,000 jobs every year. If you couple this with the reforms we're talking about that make growth more labor intensive, we could get millions of new jobs in a decade. And that's what we should aim for. I think we should all get to work. Thank you.
And thank you so very much for that. And I'm sure all of the colleagues and friends of CDE and many South Africans that are online found it quite stimulating and really directing onto what we ought to do as a country. Right now, and I'm going to ask our head of research, Dr. Stefan Shermer, to also come up online to assist with some of the Q&A. And if you've been following this discussion, you have any question or comment you want to raise to Anne, please put that on the chat box and I will read them up. And then Stefan or Anne will provide some input on your question. Let me begin with some of the points that we have in here. And you showed the slide where you displayed unemployment, but I think there's a need for others. They want to know just in terms of the demographics of the unemployment in the country. That's from Letlare that was asking that question. That's the first one. Perhaps let's take those and with the two, and then the second one is that's come from Tokozisi. Is how could South Africa be more labor intensive and provide the jobs that are needed, as you suggest in your presentation, given that we are at this time of 4IR. That's what Tokozisi is raising therein. And the other important question, and that is in here, perhaps taking it as that's the three question in the first tranche, is from Anthony, who's saying the Western Cape has managed to achieve some level of low unemployment, and what can the country learn from the Western Cape, or can what the Western Cape is doing be duplicated across the country? And I think Anne or Stefan, if you could answer those, and then I will read the rest of the other questions. And everyone that is online, please just keep posting on the chat box and we'll make sure that we get to your questions. Thanks, and you can go for that.
Well, thank you very much. These are difficult questions. Good questions, everybody. I'm going to have a bash at some of it, and then Stefan will come in as well. So the racial demographics of unemployment, very sadly, the vast majority of unskilled people in the country are Black South Africans. And that's no surprise. Apartheid disadvantaged their parents. And so a lot of people were made poor by the apartheid system. And then in the last 30 years of democracy, we have not improved our education system. It's as simple as that. And so for the vast majority of people who are poor, mainly Black South Africans, they go to terrible schools where very little teaching takes place. We could get into all of that. And then they often live in poor communities where many other people don't work. They live in families where people don't work. So it's very hard to break out of that. It's not like at the dinner table, the father or the uncle is talking about the business they're running and the children can learn from that. These are communities disconnected from work. And so for all sorts of reasons, housing policy, post-apartheid, which has inadvertently deepened the isolation of poorer people from economic opportunity, the lack of growth, our history, our terrible history of apartheid, all of this means that the vast majority of people who don't have skills, and you could see from the slide I put up, without skills, you're more than likely to be unemployed. So yes, it is mainly Black South Africans, and that's very unfortunate. So that's the first issue about racial demographics. The second issue is this question about the fourth industrial revolution and how South Africa competes. Now, I would put it this way. A top priority for South Africa is to fix its education system and its training system. And we should talk a lot less about the fourth industrial revolution or AI or technology when the vast majority of sort of 8 to 10-year-olds can't read. So the main point of what we're saying is that today, South Africa needs jobs for the labor force, the workforce we actually have. At the same time, we should be fixing the skills system and fixing the education system. That's how we, in 5 to 10 years, start being a country with a larger and larger sort of technological sector. And it's urgent because the world is changing, but there are still lots and lots and lots of low-skilled jobs to be had globally. And that's the thrust of our experimental zone at Coega. Here is a region of the country that's doing terribly economically, that is under threat because the automotive sector is under big threat. And we have put money, your and my tax money, into the infrastructure around Coega. But if you go and visit Coega, it is mainly bare veld. And we're saying, let's try something new. What do we have to lose? We've devised the kind of rules that need to be different to make it a special zone of the economy. And let's see if, like the Philippines, Cambodia, Bangladesh, many other countries, we can get a low-skill manufacturing hub going. Why not? I'd much rather live in Port Elizabeth, even today, with all South Africa's problems, than in the middle of Ethiopia. So there are real opportunities, and we can sort of deal with some of these things. And then just lastly, I think the most important reason why the Western Cape has done better when it comes to employment is that you have an administration there in the province and in the city that doesn't hate business, that isn't suspicious of business, that wants to help business to locate there and will do anything they can to attract them and to help them grow. It's a larger story than that, but we've written a document on this, or an op-ed, so you should look at that on our website. I'll stop there, and perhaps Stefan might want to come in with anything else.
Stefan, if you want to add anything on the points that Anne has made, please go for it. And we continue to receive as many questions as we can, which I will read out just after your inputs if you want to add anything, Stefan.
Great. Thanks, Wandile. If someone could turn my camera on, that'd be nice.
You can talk anyway.
Okay. Can you see me now?
Yes, Stefan.
Okay. Sorry. Right. No, I don't have a lot to add to what Anne was saying, but the issue on race and unemployment is that the majority of unemployed are African South Africans, and that male that the unemployment rate for Africans is significantly higher than it is for other racial groups, and that the group that has the highest level of unemployment, over 40%, in terms of the narrow definition, is African women. So, all the things that Anne was saying are definitely true and a big issue, which makes all of these issues even more important than they otherwise would be. On the fourth industrial revolution stuff, I mean, it is true that automation and AI and things are changing the nature of work at quite a rapid rate, but often not as fast as people think. But really, the issue is, these changes are happening, which makes us taking advantage of the opportunities that are still there, more urgent. Like, we need to get going before, these opportunities disappear, which might happen, within 10 years. So I agree with Anne on that as well.
Yeah. No, thanks so much, Stefan, on that. Let me continue with some of the questions we receive, and encourage everyone online to post some of their comments and question, and I'll read these out to Anne and Stefan. Stuart there asking or commenting that who's listening, a great presentation. Stuart, we hope that the 4 points that Anne ended with, the policymakers and many others will take from those. And let me take about 3 questions, and this will proceed in that order. The first one from Jackie, who says you mentioned the small business involvement, and how can we make funding available to them to employ young employees? Do you think the chambers of business can assist in that perspective? That's the one question, Stefan and Anne. Then we have the second question from Arila, and Arila Rosenberg is asking, she says, has research included the informal sector? And I think perhaps, Anne, you can underscore the comment you ended up with on the informal sector, because Arila there cites the work of Gigi Alcock. I think if you can elaborate on that, that's the second point. And then we have Karen, who's saying good insights and generally agree. It says, how can we help encourage? Very important recommendation as to how do we imagine some of these putting it up. Let me squeeze the last point on this second tranche of these questions, Anne and Stefan. This one is from Yokajan Pillay. I think he's from the Cape Business newspaper. I usually interact with him. He's asking, how important is the relationship to GDP growth in relation to creating more job opportunities? And I think, Anne, to your first remark about the cure being growth, perhaps maybe you can underscore on those. I'll come back to other questions and request everyone online to continue posting those. Michael, we will come next from your question. If you can take those, Stefan, and then we'll proceed in that way. Thank you.
Thanks, Wandile. Again, some important questions. Look, as I mentioned in the presentation, funding for small businesses is important. And we are suggesting that we use the funds we have much more effectively. So there is a lot of money. 6 billion a year is a lot of money. If you took half of that, I'd take more of it, but if you say you took half of that and you had some competition in the private sector, the organizations with real expertise to help small businesses, they use that money, they compete with each other to show what results they can deliver. You have a much better chance of getting results than we do in the public sector. Whoever thought that public officials who probably come from, who've never run a business, who don't know how to run a business, would be the best people to identify dynamic small businesses to support? This is a crazy idea. So we're saying sort of rethink how we spend our money. That's the first thing. The second is the private sector is not perfect in what it's done, but it's certainly, there's some very interesting funds and experiments taking place that look a lot more hopeful than what we're seeing from the public sector. So compete for that money, the public sector money, give it to them as a grant, but push the private institutions on what more will you do, so that it becomes a real partnership and we see if we can get more effective with the money that we have. There's lots more to running a small business than just money. So funding's important, but many other things as well. So that's on that question. The whole question of the informal sector is some 3.5 million people who are counted by Stats SA work in our informal sector already. Is that number perfect? Is Stats SA perfect? Well, probably not. And they themselves are adapting and looking at ways in which they might get more accurate figures if they need to, but this is not out by big margins. there's some people who stand in a particular township and then they tell us on the back of an envelope that there are millions and millions of people working in the informal sector. This is generally not true. There is a CDE document I recommend to everyone on our website with a workshop of all the experts, academic and other experts in the country on the informal sector. But I will concede, I think there's more to learn, and we certainly think the private sector might have data on the nature and of the informal sector that we could learn from, and we plan to organize something on that very soon. Perhaps I should stop there. If this, well, let me go through all four, Wandile, quickly, and then Stefan can come in on anything technical in addition. How do we get our ideas implemented? Well, we hope today the media will give us a lot of attention, and I think yesterday's announcement will help because we are putting forward a very different approach to what the president is calling an economic emergency. I agree with him on that. But really, we have to put pressure on the people in power. We have to shout about it. We have to write about it. We have to talk about the time has come to deal with the real issues that hold us back, and not tweaking what might be a bit better but isn't really dealing with 12.5 million people who want to work. So obviously the challenge is to get these things into Parliament, into policy, and into the GNU. So there are lots of new avenues for pressure here. Let me stop there, and perhaps Stefan can deal with GDP and employment.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I did just want to add something quickly about the question about small business and business associations, which I do think there's a lot of potential there. We did a little project where we worked with business associations in Alex, Soweto, Orange Farm, the inner city, and they're incredibly dynamic and well organized and understand their members quite, very well. But all of them told us that they get completely ignored by government. That government has nothing to do with them, doesn't want to listen to them, and works independently of them, which I think is crazy. So I think that is a good idea. On the GDP issue, if I understand, just in terms of the technicalities of it, the sort of elasticity rate that we use is 0.6, which is broadly the historical one in South Africa. And that means that for every 1% of growth, we get an increase of jobs at 0.6. We think that's low. It's not completely out of whack with other sort of middle income countries, but given our situation, we think if we implemented our reforms, that would lead to something much closer to 1-to-1 or even better. So that's why we think the millions of jobs can be created if real reform takes place, and that's the only long-term strategy that'll work.
No, thanks so much, Stefan, for that, and thanks. And let's continue, Anne and Stefan, with a couple of points that people are putting on the chat box in here. And let's start off with I'll take about 4 or 5 of these with Michael Khan, and I think he's raising an important point, and that perhaps you can start with tackling it. I'll give about 4 points, but what Michael is asking is, why are we silent on the issue of the power of unions and some of the stranglehold that they present both on growth and just on the labor market side. And I think, and on your interventions where you were talking about what we need to do to loosen up some regulation, perhaps you can elaborate on that and add the point about the unions. That's what Michael Khan is asking about. Fatis, we see your comments there, and I think the remark by Stefan about the challenges of the small businesses are related to that. What Fatis was asking asking, Stefan, was really around the barriers of the SMMEs and various stringent barriers that we put in place, immigration and all of those things. Perhaps you can make a side comment on that when you guys come in. The second question, and perhaps drawing on some of our previous work at CDE, you can comment on this. It comes from Peter Setau, who's saying we seem to have a bit of an urban bias in our thinking of development and the jobs. It says, what about the rural development and their impact that it will create jobs? And that's the point there that is raising. And he says this will also, to a certain extent, manage the migration from rural to urban. Perhaps you can comment also on that point. That's the second question. The third question from Agnes is asking that on the issue of education, perhaps maybe we can make a comment on that. Why are we not funding the TVET colleges and STEM, all of those things? Perhaps you can also speak on that as a third question. And I see there is also a couple of comments that are being put in place here. And to everyone that is asking if this report and the presentation will be online, their question to that is yes, it will be online. Stefan, there's a point here from someone jealous who's asking about the macroeconomic framework at which all of what CDE is presenting today. He says maybe if you could comment on the macroeconomic framework of that. Let's take the last one for this round from Terence Creamer, who's saying, should big business extricate itself from current partnership with government on electricity, logistic crime, youth, and possibly Joburg revival? If so, what should the new relationship look like between government and business? Perhaps, and you can comment on that given your work we are doing in Joburg. And he says also any response on the ANC's latest economic proposals. That's the other question from Terence Creamer. If we could take those, and then Dave Wilson, we will start from you and continue with these questions in the next round. And we encourage all of you, with the time we have, that you continue to put some of these questions on the chat box. Thank you. Over to you, Anne.
Well, thank you. Another round of challenging questions. To Michael Kahn, of course, we're dealing with the unions. When we say don't extend collective bargaining agreements, you know exactly what the obstacle is to that. But it's two things. You see, I think we have unions with too much say over the rules of our labor market, and we have a weak government that is too complicit in not thinking about the entire workforce and only thinking about the organized part at the top of our labor force. So we are thinking hard about the unions. And I mean, that issue, the whole question of a exploratory or experimental zone, is to break the deadlock. We're in deadlock, the country, in terms of labor unions that won't allow their alliance partner, the ANC, to make any moves to open up the market for young, inexperienced work seekers. And we've been putting a lot of time and energy into how do you get around that. Now, there are many ways around it. We are trying to be constructive in breaking the deadlock. And after all, that's what China did at a time when many people in China didn't want to allow foreign corporations into that country. What Deng did was he allowed a zone to be created around Shanghai where you could let the foreign devil in. And they let the foreign devil, multinational companies, into China. And very soon people could see the enormous positive impact of that on national wealth, on jobs, on development. And then other parts of the country wanted to follow that. So that's part of the thinking of how you might break deadlocks that South Africa currently has in terms of dealing with some fundamental issues in the labor market. But we are also making some clear proposals that would require the politicians, in particular the president, to think much harder about how you build alliances for reform. It's not enough to just say, oh, I can't move because they're my alliance partners, which nobody says, honestly. But you've got to, if you're an effective reformer, you have to decide on what you want to achieve, a much more open labor market. And then you have to think about who can support this outside perhaps your normal areas of support. How do you mobilize a coalition for change? That's what we're talking about. So we are very much focused on those kinds of issues. And as I said, our education system is appalling. Well, maybe I didn't say it, but if you have a situation where at least 6 of our provincial education departments are controlled by the South African Democratic Trade Union, you need real political muscle to introduce reform. And that's what South Africa's missing, a real commitment to fundamental reforms. Let me stop there. On the whole question of urban bias, well, firstly, I invited Wandile to chair this session today because we can ask him to say a few things about rural jobs, but we're certainly not biased. We think South Africa's rural areas have always had a bad deal and had terrible things done to them during apartheid. And now, although there is so much potential for the expansion of agriculture, we have another deadlock around expropriation without compensation, and not to mention the logistics crisis that affects expansion. But clearly there are more jobs to be had in agriculture, and we should be looking at how we break those deadlocks. But I'm sure Wandile will be able to add more detail to that. I think there was a question about funding the TVETs. The issue isn't funding. There's more than enough money. We just don't get value for money from the TVETs or the SETAs. And what we're saying is you need a different approach so that we get results. In terms of TVETs, it needs to be a real partnership with private companies who know what they need, who often have trainers who could help train, but putting the wrong people to train people who've never worked in a company in the TVETs, you get a big dropout rate, you get enormous wastage of money. So the issue isn't money, it's value for money, and that needs reform in TVETs. The SETAs, we're saying, scrap them, have a completely different system, much more privately focused, and we would get much better results, and we might even save some money because the SETAs are expensive with very few results at all. Let me come to the last biggest question. Mr. Kramer has asked about 2 things. I am certainly not saying that the business-government partnership has no value or should end. I think anyone who argued that would be wrong. I am opposed to some of the ways in which it operates. I'm not in favor of secret meetings all the time. I would like to know a lot more. I think the public needs to know more, and it's hard to distinguish hope and hype from reality. But I am not saying we should stop that, and I know there are many individuals and companies putting a lot of work into this. On the other hand, I think the challenges that face South Africa are not technical capacity. They have to do first and foremost with the quality of leadership, the individuals in charge of key institutions. That's number 1. And number 2, they have to do with what they are charged to do. So yes, we've made some progress in Eskom. There are many fathers of progress, as we know. But we don't have a competitive market for energy. And as a reasonably well-informed citizen, I cannot tell you today how long it's going to take before we get to a competitive market for energy and we no longer have administered prices by NERSA. So the cost of energy is crippling South African industry. I live in Johannesburg, where the joys of no longer having load shedding are tempered by load reduction by a useless city council and city power. So we have enormous problems here that are not just technical. They have to deal with leadership, cadre deployment rather than expertise, and they have to do with policy. I'm in favor of competition for our major services as quickly as possible. And that means companies have to compete with each other, not you allocate one railway line to this company and another railway line to another one. That doesn't give us competition. So I think there are important challenges. My main point would be that the business-government partnership has tended to silence business in public about the country's challenges, not totally, but that shouldn't be the only thing that big business is doing. Big business needs to be shouting out loudly and providing its own proposals of how we deal with many of our challenges. And I'm not in favor of compromise anymore. I was never in favor of compromise. Maybe I was wrong, but I'm certainly not in favor of compromise about what needs to be done now. The president is finally saying we're in an economic emergency. We are saying the unemployment situation is catastrophic. In this context, business should be speaking its mind and should be putting energy into how do we deal with unemployment? How do we deal with education? How do we deal with things, and not compromising all the time on the government's agenda? So I could go on this topic, but I'm certainly, it's a both and. Get involved and be much tougher and clearer and constructive about what needs to be done, and say it cleanly. Don't compromise on this. You think about the mining industry, which is a complete disaster and has been. That is a man-made disaster in all senses of that word. We should be spelling out very clearly what should be done, and it starts with the top individuals. We can't run South Africa with the current cabinet. It's not possible. So on the president's statement yesterday, the ANC NEC statement, the president read out, I'm happy to comment on two areas. You've seen we have very different position on what to do about unemployment, and we have a very different position on what to do about small business development, which I think are polar opposites from where the president or the NEC is at. We will be commenting on the full statement more fully shortly, but not now. Thanks. Stefan.
Thanks so much. And Stefan, perhaps maybe you can just cover the question about the macroeconomic framework that would be appropriate for what Anne had presented as the intervention to materialize.
Thanks, Wandile. I did just want to say something about SMEs and regulation, which was the one question that came up. As Anne mentioned, South Africa ranks as the most regulated, and not in a good way, economy in the OECD. And that includes a lot of countries like Brazil, Mexico, that are sort of at similar levels of development to us. And the thing about that is, it covers a lot of, it's a broad frame, it doesn't just look at sort of licensing stuff, although that does matter. But it's small business that suffers the most from those things. Big business can deal with those costs, and they're set up to manage their way through it. But small businesses don't have that ability, and they're the ones that really suffer from it. But there's a lot of other things that stand in the way of small business. That really matter a lot. And we don't know how much cutting red tape will really impact. And, cutting red tape needs to be part of a broader strategy towards small business. But our idea is really to like find out from small business how they see the situation, because I got involved in this quite a lot, and you just go round and round in circles. There's 1,000 things to think about, and and obviously some regulation benefits some people and doesn't benefit other people. So our approach of doing it bottom up and then seeing what happens, I think is the right way to go. On the funding TBETs, which is like a lead-in into the macroeconomic issue, we deliberately focused our reforms in that area on things that wouldn't cost money and or would save money. And the reason we do that is because South Africa doesn't have any money, and that's the big macroeconomic framework that we're looking at. On our current trajectory, we're heading for disaster. We have to change it. We have to cut spending so that we get onto a more sustainable trajectory, because that is absolutely fundamental for investment. People will not invest in a country that is on an unsustainable fiscal trajectory. So that's an absolutely fundamental bottom line. We need to not increase spending at a macro level. We need to decrease it. And we need to think about reform in that context.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Stefan, for that. And we continue to receive some of these questions in here, which we appreciate. But let me comment very quickly on the rural aspect that was raised by Mr. Peter Setau. And I will say two quick things on that. One, affirm Ernst's point that there's not necessarily a bias towards the urban side. The rural economy potential is still there. Our belief is that there could still be close to the million jobs that the NDP talked about in 2012 in farming and its value chain, not just the primary agriculture combined on that. And of course, then when the NDP published that, there were 700,000 or so jobs in the farming sector in 2012. Today, they are about 920,000. But we are far from the target that was put in place. To my second point, then, what is holding everything back? It again underscores the points that N was saying, because we have about 2.5 million hectares of land that is sitting in the state, and it has not been released with title deeds to individuals who can use to both expand farming businesses and the value chains, that expansion that can happen, as well as subsequently then the jobs. And the people that should be doing that is the Department of Land Reform and Rural Development, Minister Nyonso, jointly with Minister Steenhuisen on unlocking that. And I think if they can do their part on that, then the rejuvenation of rural economy, that's the first step amongst other things that the Department of Agriculture could do. I'll say that for now on that, Mr. Peter Setau. Let me continue then with some of these questions. And I think Dave Wilson's point is more around of a comment, and Stefan is really speaking about the role of national mentorship program, and saying that there is a bit of a potential for that, to make sure that these young people that you showed on the queue are not, their self-esteem and their confidence and the networks is something that we build. Perhaps you will comment on that as part of your input later. And running quickly, Mbongeni is saying unemployed youth is not a heterogeneous thing in South Africa. We keep hearing about the lack of skills for high unemployment. But the economy is not growing. And I guess this, Stefan, it speaks again to the point that you have just made about the framework of the economic conditions that we are in. Running quickly on these questions, a number of them, they go back to the issue of the SMMEs and the TVET colleges. There's another one, and that I think is the first question you may want to note down there. It says business is from BevJack, who says business has generally perceived the employment tax incentive as positive incentive that can directly benefit new hires. And can this be expanded through positive policy reforms? It would welcome any insight about the employment tax initiative. Perhaps you can start with this one. Carol Church is asking if have you met Stefan and Anne with the GNU, who and when and what feedback received. But I think you have covered that, Anne, about the general thinking about the GNU. And Mr. Adrian Basso, we appreciate your support at News 24. And I think you are echoing Anne's point about that the media will enable us in carrying some of this message forward. So we appreciate your support on that. And I think a majority of some of these questions that are really coming on, it's on these points that you have already talked about. And perhaps as a closing of all of this discussion, you can also comment on the issue of the national debate, which is one of the points that Neil Coleman and the others have also put forward in their comments in here in this question. So if you can put your closing remarks and touching on all of those comments that I mentioned here and there, and then followed by Stefan, and then we'll be able to wrap up the conversation for the day. Over to you, Anne.
Why don't I suggest Stefan picks up some issues and then I'll make the final comments, if that's okay. Stefan?
That's excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure which issues to pick up in terms of detailed questions.
Pick one or two.
One or two, Stefan, on SMMEs, national debate, all of those aspects, just as a closing remark of your thinking about employment.
Well, I'll let Anne deal with the national debate issues. I've spoken about SMEs. Obviously, we think they're very important. We want to unblock the development of the informal sector. We want to cut the red tape that's holding back small business. We want to transform our cities to make them more business friendly. And, we really, really need a much more positive approach to markets and business than we've got.
Great, thanks. Let me make a few points. The first, Bev Jack asks about the employment tax incentive. Bev, we've done a lot of thinking on this. You should read our document on Kucha, on a special economic zone for Kucha, and we do deal with how we would expand that incentive. So there's quite a lot to say about that, but read that report. We go into more detail on the issue there. Let me talk about the national debate. What CDE is trying to do today is to stress how vast this challenge is. That's number one. We're saying it's enormous. It's millions and millions and millions of people. So small little projects, which might be very good, are politically irrelevant and they're numerically insignificant. So I think that's a very big point we're trying to make. The only way to deal with the scale of unemployment is to get our economy going, and that requires a lot more than fixing logistics and energy, which are vital, absolutely vital, but not enough. So you've got to do a lot more to make this economy really competitive. So we've got to get a much faster growth rate. And it's important to link what is often a very loose discussion about jobs or job creation to growth. That's the second thing we're trying to do. The third and big focus for today is we're saying, in addition to getting faster growth, we have to make the economy more labor absorbing. And here's a good place to start. And those are our 4 recommendations. For areas of recommendation. And that's something that most people don't want to talk about because they don't want to wrestle with the fundamental issues that then get them into conflict with trade unions and other people. And we're saying you have to deal with these issues. And we've come with not a full-scale reform of the labor rules. That's not what we're calling for, and that would be a misinterpretation of what we're saying. We're saying here are very specific proposals. You know, Wandile just before COVID, business had a very big workshop with the president on all sorts of issues in early 2020. And at that meeting, the president said, there are people who say our labor market is too rigid and we must reform it, but they never tell me what to change. CDE then wrote 2 very detailed op-eds, articles on this is what you must change, Mr. President. Did anyone in business take up those issues? No, not in public. Did the president respond? Of course not. So we're trying to say there are very specific things we could do, as well as an experimental zone in Kucha, which, as somebody said to me after our last presentation on that zone, they said, what would it harm to try something new? It's not like we're doing well at the moment. So let me come to the national debate and one of the comments made by Neil Coleman, which is that what we are proposing is not what South Africa has been doing. It's very different. And to imply that this is more of the same, which has failed, would be completely misleading and wrong. We are saying the country needs a completely different direction. First and foremost, you need a common diagnosis of why we're in trouble. And then you need a very different cure for what ails the country. And what we are proposing has never been implemented. So that's the first point we would make. I think the second point is that it's time people actually said what they would do precisely, and it has to be within the context, as Stefan has highlighted, of fiscal crisis. The president says he wants to massively expand his presidential employment stimulus. Well, at the same time, he says we have to cut expenditure in the budget. Where will the money come from? Anyway, you can't use public money to deal with a crisis of 12.5 million people. It's impossible. You have to get markets and firms to do that. So let me end there. Thank you very much for being our chair, Mr. Wandile.
Thank you so very much, and thanks to everyone that joined us and spent this morning with us. And then I think these interventions that you've presented here only enhance what all of us as South Africans need in resolving our triple challenge of low growth, poverty, and unemployment. And I think there are many others that may have the ideas, but I think what you have put on the table is one of the steps of saying, how do we resolve that? And yes, largely focused in a broader part of South Africa, but certainly CDE not ignoring the rural economy aspect. And in fact, if anyone goes to the CDE publications site on the website, you will see some of our work that we have done on land reform and the other aspect, which pretty much underscored the points that CDE has as to what could happen. And the rural economy could still present that million jobs, but land reform and land that is owned by government, 2.5 million hectares, should be released to private individuals with title deeds. About the report, others who are asking the technical of it as well as the presentations, this will be available on CDE website. We encourage all of you to go look at the report, read it, and disseminate in your networks, because ultimately then you will be the vehicle of taking some of these ideas and making sure they are part and parcel of the discussion and the implementation. And thank you so very much for spending this morning with us. Goodbye.
Thank you.